Ready, we can start the next panel, which is titled Debative the Normative Foundations of the News. And I think it will definitely continue some of the conversations we're having about the findings from the previous presentations. There are some other questions in the chat for the panelists or for everyone, and I encourage people to continue talking about these issues in the chat even as we are moving on to a different panel. And I am now pleased to welcome again Thea de Gruchy from the University of Witwatersrand, who has kindly volunteered to chair this panel. And I'm happy to pass her the gavel.
Thanks so much, Christian. Nice to see a bunch of familiar faces and Zoom names. Welcome to today's second panel, debating the normative foundations of the news. We have three really great sounding presentations lined up. Just to let the presenters know, I'll let you know when you hit the 12-minute mark. So I have like 3 minutes until 15 minutes, and then let you know when you hit the 15-minute mark. I won't completely cut you off if you go into, like, if you go over 15 minutes, but just be aware that you'll be eating into your 10 minutes of discussion time. And just apologies if I mispronounce anyone's names or institutional affiliations over the next hour or so. So we're going to start off our presentations with one titled Fair and Balanced: What News Audiences in 4 Countries Mean When They Say They Prefer Impartial News. This is from a group at the University of Oxford, and I believe that Camila Mont'Alverne will be giving the presentation today. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. Thank you so much.
Over to you, Camila.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Can you see it correctly?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for having me here. I'm here to present a paper that we made in the Trusting News project from the Reuters Institute. And we start our paper by arguing why we should look at what people say about impartiality. And one of the reasons to do so is that impartiality is one of the reasons that journalists often present to argue with why audiences should trust them when they are asked why the information they provide is better than other information that people can get in other sources. They usually mention their procedures and norms they have to produce news, and often impartiality, balance, and other principles are mentioned by them. This is also this importance of impartiality is also in some way aligned to what the people says it wants. Some research already shows that most audiences around the several countries researched say they prefer impartial news. But we also discovered in previous research that this preference tends to be concentrated in some specific demographic groups, like people who are older and have some advantaged backgrounds, that are more likely to say that they prefer impartial news. And at the same time, we also find that this preference for impartial news is associated with lower levels of trusting news. So all of this makes us question about what people really mean when they say they prefer impartiality. This is also connected with some research that says, when listening to audiences, that says that common critiques about impartiality involve perceptions of bias, of journalists as self-interested actors, and some lack of autonomy in their jobs. So we depart from the idea that there are some gaps between what journalists and audiences believe is important when it comes to news. And maybe one of the places that this gap can appear is when it comes to impartiality and what people understand from that. We also acknowledge that people often rely on narratives about how other people operate, And this is also something that it's important for them to make their decisions about how to act. And we call this kind of beliefs as folk theories, in our case, folk theories of journalism. That would be these popular beliefs about what journalism is, what it does, and what it ought to do, so that people use to make sense of their relationship with news in their daily lives. So we depart from two research questions in this paper. The first one is simply asking what do audiences in four countries that are Brazil, India, the UK, and the US mean when they say they want impartial news. So what people want to say when they express their preference for impartial news. And the second research question is what kind of critiques these audiences in the four countries have when it comes to how news organizations in their countries perform as impartial sources of information. We do that by using qualitative interviews and focus groups with more than 100 people in the four countries. This is part of the Trusting News project. And these interviews were initially about trusting news, and people talked about several aspects of their news consumption and their relationship with news organizations. We conducted them, both the focus groups and the interviews were conducted online due to COVID in the beginning of this year, January and February. We also recruited adults in the four countries using a question about their degrees of trust in information from the news media, and they were divided in more and less trusting people according to their answers. And we analyzed the transcripts of the interviews and the focus groups as a team. Our research team did it in a collaborative way. And in this paper specifically, we focus on the part of the transcripts that mention the importance of impartiality, the expectations people have towards news, and critiques about where journalists fail to provide impartial news. So going to our results, first we answered our first research question about what participants mean when they say they prefer impartial news. And the first thing we find is that the majority of people define impartiality as a neutral balance. That would be the best way for journalists to perform their function of informing the audiences. Many of our interviewees talk about reporting the facts correctly and offering the real truth. And some of them even say they don't want things to get much complicated. They want only the facts, and that would be what they see as impartial. There are some other interviews that doubt that it's possible to achieve impartiality, and for some, they even question if impartiality would be the best way or the preferable way of reporting news. There is, for example, this interview in the UK that says that when covering Black Lives Matter, she would like a little bit more than just the facts. So answering our first research question, we can say that people in general say that they prefer impartial news, but have divergent understandings of what constitutes impartial news when asked about that in practice. Some even have a hard time to define it and to go beyond the idea of offering the truth. And there is also considerably agreement about impartiality being a lack of bias and lack of opinion, although the participants in general, they have different perspectives about if they think journalists could achieve impartiality, and a small part of the sample even says that in some cases it's not exactly desirable. This leads us to our second research question about the critiques audiences have when it comes to how impartial news organizations in their countries are. And we find the folk theory that it's expressed, that we find by several participants in all the 4 countries. It's the notion that news organizations are not impartial because they have ulterior motives that make them manipulate segments of the audience or trying and having some political or commercial gain. This is a folk theory that it's widespread in the 4 countries, and often people also have specific critiques about the aspects they saw as violations of impartiality, but this idea was articulated by several interviewees that that participated on the study. The first the first argument they used to talk about this folk theory is that would be that journalists and news organizations would aim to deceive and to manipulate the audience. So many of our interviews were explicit about the idea that they operate, that journalists and news organizations operate according to their own motivations that are often self-interested and not based on a professional code. And so this appears when people talk about the journalists want to manipulate mass with distorted news, or the idea that someone or somewhere is controlling what we hear as news. The second reason that concerns these ulterior motives would be political reasons for doing it. So this is especially prevalent in people who are politically engaged. So for them, the version of truth that the news media would offer is intentionally trying to deceive them and only offers one part of the story for the public. And there are also commercial motives that would be basically the idea is that since journalists and news organizations are seeking profit, this would make it impossible for them to be impartial. In the UK, this is specifically important because some of the interviewees mentioned they see commercial brands and as less trustworthy sources when compared to public broadcasters. So we see, and this is not so prevalent in the other countries because they don't have such an important public service media. So summarizing our second research question, we find that the critiques about violation of impartiality come from a folk theory about the intentions and the reasons journalists and news organizations have. Many of our interviews were sure that the news outlets based their editorial decisions on hidden reasons. And this would be specifically the idea of persuading or manipulating the public for political or commercial gains. And this is present even among people who have some degree of trust in news. So it shows how widespread this folk theory is between our interviews. And another important point is that at the core of people's critiques, there is often a suspicion about the hidden agendas or intentions that journalists and news organizations have. And in some cases, people have some events and some experiences in which they anchor that. but in other cases they don't even have concrete examples of violations. What don't mean they don't exist, but they aren't able to articulate them, but they still have the idea that this is a very central point in journalist work. So
Camila, sorry, you just have 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. I'm just concluding. So going back to the discussion and taking a few points from what we knew before the study, basically we knew there were some differences in attitudes about impartiality, but not exactly why. And now we know that people have similar ideas in abstract about what impartiality is, and they value it. But in practice, they are focused on the intentions or reasons that journalists and news organizations have. And the folk theories we have may be especially appealing for groups that tend to say they value less impartiality, such as young people or those who rely on social media for news. Also, part of this folk theory can also be used by people who appreciate impartiality, but thinks that journalism was practiced in a different way in the past, and now these hidden motives are more powerful and make it harder for journalists to be impartial. Just to conclude, so we both academics and journalists like to think as impartiality as a way of serving as a check on ulterior motives to avoid them or to make it harder for them to influence news. But what our study shows is that for many people, this is often seen as something that it's used to mask these reasons, these politically or commercial reasons and the imperfections in the journalist's work. Also, we argue that building back trust in news in this case requires convincing audiences not only that the journalists often a content that it's balanced and bias-free, but also that these editorial decisions are not based on these hidden motives that people are sure that are important for the journalist coverage. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Camila. That was a really fantastic presentation, and thank you for sticking to time. I'm now going to open it up for the next 10 minutes for any comments or questions. I see that we already have 2 in the chat box, which is really great. The first one is from Shahid Ali, who asks, was there any difference in relation to the factors of high context and low context societies of these countries? And Maja Simunjak asks, any indications in data about how people came to hold these views, i.e. how did they become convinced that journalists have hidden and ulterior motives? Camila, do you want to start us off by answering those 2 questions?
Of course, thank you for the questions. About the first one, I think it's important to mention that since we did our interviews using basically depending on video conference and reliable internet access, we have some limitations in the profile of interviews we got. They tend to be more educated and more than the average at least than the rest of the rest of their countries. But I echoed what Christian just said about elaborating a little bit more on the high context and the low context, because I don't think I fully understood the question. And sorry, go ahead.
No. Should we deal with that first? Shahid, do you want to just elaborate a bit on that, and then we can deal with that question?
Yeah, hello. I just want to ask that, these are 2 different type of societies. One is a high context society where you don't overtly say whatever you want to say. And then there is a low context society where you say whatever you say, you mean that. So that's the difference. High context where the context plays a major role, and the meaning, you have to really make an effort to drive out the meaning of these words. So that's in high context. That's basically the South of Asian societies, as we can say India and Pakistan, since I'm from Pakistan. And then the low context society, where everybody, whatever you say, you mean that. So was there any difference in relation, or was this factor kept in mind? I just wanted to know.
You mean the differences between the countries themselves? Oh, okay. Yeah, I think we found more similarities than we would expect between them, especially when it comes to impartiality and how people in general seem to appreciate it. But one of the things that we can say it's different in the UK, for example, is the importance of brands like BBC and public service media, which doesn't appear that much, or not as a reference as it is in the UK, in the other countries. In India, there is also a difference of people being more open about expressing their appreciation for entertainment news, which is a little bit different in the other countries, where people in general say, even if they appreciate entertainment, they usually don't articulate that and say they stick to impartiality. So I think we have much more similarities, but we can find some of the differences also.
Great, thanks, thanks, Camila. So there's been another question which you already sort of started to elaborate on about your study participants being, having it being a bit more educated than the norm. But there's been another question to ask if you could just elaborate further on sort of study background, age, gender of the participants. And I wondered also whether you could maybe give us a sense of how you actually recruited them. I know you said it was all, the research itself was virtual, but how you actually found these participants would be, and whether that differed across the 4 contexts would be really interesting.
Perfect. We partnered with YouGov to recruit them. So we had, besides the screening question on trusting news, we also had some screening question on their age, gender, background, political ideology, evaluations of the leaders of these countries. So in the end, they are similar in a way that they are more educated than the average. But we had people from different backgrounds in terms of age. For example, our participants are since people who are over 18 until 64 or something around these lines. We also had a gender balance between women and men. And we try to get different backgrounds concerning also their political ideologies. So they are different they are more educated than the average of the country, but they are different in that when it comes to their backgrounds.
Great, thank you. And there's been another question from Duran, who asks, could there be an influence of the political context, i.e. leaders' attitudes towards the media in those countries? And I think this also ties in a bit with the earlier question, which I know you started to answer, and then we got a bit sidetracked about how participants became convinced that journalists have hidden and ulterior motives.
Yeah, I think this is the hard question to ask, because of course the political context is important there. We have some cases I remember in Brazil, also in the US and in India, in which people in a lot of ways made references to how the media covered the political leaders they liked, for example, Modi or Bolsonaro or Trump, and how this was a reason for why they don't think the media is impartial, because the political leaders they support tend to get don't get the favorable news that they would expect them to have. But I think, although this is an important factor, I think the political inclination doesn't explain everything, because we also have cases in which people are not necessarily affiliated or not necessarily politically interested, and they still have a sense of thinking of journalists as bullies or as self-interested people. So in the end, I would say that, yeah, the political context is essential to these, especially for those who say that journalists act in a political way and try to favor some parties. But there are other kind of suspicions that are also important for how people create their perceptions. And of course, I don't think one thing that probably helps is how journalists and how news organizations in these countries are often part of a lot of political controversies. In Brazil, we have the impeachments we had in the last 20 or 30 years. In the UK, you have Brexit, and people always also reference these kind of things, even if their party or the politicians they prefer are not in power anymore.
Thanks so much, Camila. It's now time for our second presentation, but for those of you who still have comments, please just pop them in the chat. I'm sure that Camila can respond to them in the chat box. It's now time for our second presentation, which is by Nick Anstead from the London School of Economics, titled Fake News and Value Pluralism, a Liberal Response to Post-Truth Politics. Over to you, Nick.
First of all, let me just say it's so unbelievably lovely to be here, because this is one of my very favorite conferences, and I know it's still sort of virtual rather than real, but it feels just amazing. So thank you to all the organizers for all the efforts they put into organizing this. This is a sort of a new avenue for me, because I'm trying to do some work, I guess, in what would be termed, in inverted commas, proper political theory. And I'm gonna, in the sort of duration of this paper, I'm going to explain sort of how I got here and the problem I'm seeking to address. In fact, let me sort of explain the structure of what I'm going to say. It's kind of in two parts, really. So whenever we talk about fake news, the first question that I think appears is, well, what exactly is it? How do we define it? And this, as I'm going to demonstrate to you, a lot of ink has been spilt in various ways in attempting to deal with this problem. And then in my previous work, I sort of came up with a working definition of fake news that I was happy with. But then this created another challenge. And then hopefully what I'm going to do in the second half of this paper is offer, I'm going to call it a solution with a question mark. It's at least a different way of thinking about the problem of fake news that I then think maybe has the possibility of reframing some of the debates we're having in the policy space about this area. So, yeah, the problem of definition. Anyone who's read in the area of fake news and misinformation will be familiar that this is a really slippery concept. And there are various ways in which people have gone about attempting to define it. I actually tried to systemize this, and I used a really, really great paper by Bell in 2016. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's actually a paper he tries to define liberalism, which is also a very slippery concept. And he offers no fewer than 6 different ways you can construct a definition in this paper. First of all, he gives what I've termed, this is my language rather than his, but what I've termed the substantive forms of definition. So he calls these the prescriptive, the comprehensive, and the explanative. And so the prescriptive is where you seek to identify a correct usage of a term. And we see this in the discussion of fake news, but we particularly see it, I think, in the technical definitions of fake news, where people are trying to say this is fake and this is real. he also suggests there's something called a comprehensive definition. This is where we maybe try and typologize a concept. And so in the context of fake news, this might say, well, we have things like propaganda and satire, and these are different ideas of fake news. And we have, 6 different types of fake news. This would be a different sort of definition. And then he also offers what he calls the explanative definition. And this is where you focus on the development of a term, how did it emerge, you situate it. And again, we see this in the discussion of fake news. This is ultimately the form of definition I settle on in my work, but other people, people like Lance Bennett, have used this definition model as well. And this quite often fits into a discussion about declining public trust, institutional change, the different ways in which we get our news. Interestingly, Bell also offers sort of what I'm going to call quasi-definitions. So he calls it the narrative definition. This is a slightly more polemical version of a contextual definition, but it's characterized by discussions of rise and fall or declinist accounts or crisis. We might also have dismissive or replacement definitions. In other words, we say, oh, this concept's a bit nebulous, it's not really worth defining, it's not useful, here's a better term. And also we might just make a simple assumption that this term doesn't really need defining, it's self-evident what this term means. We see this in a lot of popular commentary on fake news. But I settle in my work, and I published a book earlier this year, just a short book on fake news, and I settle on this historical contextual definition. And really what I argue in this volume is that fake news, if you like, is the product of the decline of a set of institutional practices that Western societies particularly, but not exclusively, allowed to define what truth was, right? And so if you like, the embodiment of this set of practices is what I would term the journalist gatekeeper. So if you like, previously, this era of traditional media, what we see is a much greater role being played by editors and journalists in terms of policing the information and the arguments that are in circulation. Now, clearly we know, it's been a central theme of many of the papers in this conference, that the information environment is generally more porous, there are new actors, more readily able to circulate information. So if you like, that role of the journalist gatekeeper has been degraded. It's worth noting that this idea about how societies choose to define truth and whom they bestow the legitimacy to define truth upon, this shift away from a set of institutional arrangements is not historically unprecedented. So the previous sort of example one might draw on, there are many, but one you could think about is the rise of vernacular Bibles in late medieval Europe. So in that setting, you previously have a single set of authority figures, i.e. the Catholic Church, through its control, particularly of the Latin Bible, that controls information and ideas. And of course, they start to lose control of this in the pre-Reformation and then the Reformation period. So we are seeing a set of circumstances that are at least historically imaginable, previously imaginable, playing out. But what makes our circumstances distinct is that it's the undermining of a previous set of liberal democratic, liberal technocratic, Sylvia Weisbad calls them in his article on this subject, liberal technocratic political media institutions being undermined. So it's a particular set of institutional arrangements that are being undermined. This incidentally helps us answer a question that I think is important when we talk about fake news, because one of those, if you like, arguments, one of those quasi-definitions that we don't really need to define this term, or this term is not really worth bothering with, is that, well, it's fake news has always existed, or misinformation has always existed, but if you situate it in this set of institutional circumstances, it becomes a distinct historical moment and a particular challenge that it poses to our particularly liberal democratic societies. So this was the definition I settled on, but this then I felt created a problem, a normative problem, if you like, which is that if fake news is the product created by a set of historically contingent sets of institutions and social practices and their declining authority, then on what normative basis can we actually defend liberal democratic political institutions? Because if we say these things are historically contingent, then our ability to defend them and argue for them decreases. So I suppose one answer is, well, we shouldn't, right? One answer is we don't actually attempt to defend them. And of course, there's plenty of evidence, if you like, that those institutions, let's call them, for want of a better phrase, the traditional media, the mainstream media, have often failed in the tests set for them by democratic and media theorists, right? They haven't necessarily represented diversity well. They haven't necessarily been inclusive of the diverse voices within society. They've excluded groups. And that criticism is important. And I come back to that in the answer I give. But nevertheless, I think there is a case for searching for a new theoretical basis to understand the history of those institutions and imagine different ways of tackling the challenge of fake news that their decline in authority represents. And so my, if you like, attempt to reach for an answer took me into the world of political theory, and it took me particularly into the ideas of a set of political theories called value pluralism. And these are most famously associated with the political theorist Isaiah Berlin. I suspect most undergraduates in politics have read Berlin's famous essay on freedom. It's kind of one of the set texts that is on reading lists around the world. But his sort of bigger contribution is the idea of what's termed value pluralist political theory. And Berlin situates this idea against two different traditions in political theory. The main one he situates against, and his main sort of rival, if you like, is monism, right? And he traces this right back to Plato, but clearly his intellectual sights are set particularly on Hegelian theories, including Marxism and Marxist-Leninism, given he was writing in the 50s and 60s. But this is the idea that there's a single universal truth. He also, though, argues that value pluralism is not the same as relativism. In other words, you have unlimited, unmeasurable versions of the truth. So value pluralism is something distinctive from either of these ideas. Instead, what it insists upon is the existence of multiple value systems, and each of these value systems is capable of generating distinctive and possibly contradictory truths. The key word in this theory, and possibly the most important idea with it, and what sets it apart from monism, is that these truths are incommensurate. In other words, there is no way of measuring them against each other. There is no way of putting these various truth claims together, debating them rationally, and coming out with a final answer about what the actual truth is. And this is important because it fundamentally changes the nature of the question we are asking.
Nick, just to let you know, you have 3 minutes left.
That's lovely, thank you. Instead of saying, what is the truth, or how do we discover it? Instead, we have to ask, how do different truth claims coexist in society? And because value pluralism is not relativism, in other words, we can't have unlimited truth claims, we also have to ask, well, we can have multiple truth claims, but on what basis can we exclude information, arguments, and ideas from the public discourse? So there are sometimes reasons for exclusion. I'll come to that in a second. But ultimately, it's about coexistence. So as I thought about this, what I started to realize is there are possibly two different ways in which we could start to impose boundaries on debate with a value pluralist framework. So the first issue is the consistency test. In other words, are truth claims internally logical with the value system that produced them? This clearly leads to difficult questions. And I'm going to finish this presentation with an example. It's not the most extreme example, it's a slightly flippant example, but nevertheless, I think it poses this question about what do we actually define as a value system within us? Yeah, and of course, the extreme examples are, for example, do we refine racist beliefs or Nazism as a value system? Interestingly, some other philosophers in this tradition did grapple with exactly that question about how do you handle the far right in the value pluralist framework. But this idea, is it internally logical? In other words, does the truth claim make sense within the value system that generated it? Secondly, does it undermine other value systems, what I call the coexistence test? And this is interesting because fake news is so often linked to political violence, attacks on minority groups. I mean, obviously, this does raise questions about causation, kind of the classic liberal idea about the harm principle, but how do you actually link the speech act to the harm that's committed? And on what basis do you then remove that speech act from the public discourse? So, these are questions rather than answers, but they maybe offer distinct principles about how we can start to think about fake news and misinformation that's different from simply the idea of there's a single truth, does it measure up to that standard? This is an example I discovered last night. And it just, I think, illustrates this first test nicely about, well, what's a value system and what's a truth claim? Apparently, it is kicking off at the Yoga Journal because someone wrote an article called Getting Vaxxed Was My Act of Ahimsa. And ahimsa is, I believe, a Hindi word, but is used in yoga to basically mean not doing harm, or it sometimes means love. And this person said, well, getting vaccinated is something I did because it meets this test. And then, of course, there were loads of comments sort of, attacking this idea, accusing people of selling out to big pharmacy companies. And I think this is an interesting example because we can say, well, clearly, I don't think anyone would dispute that Hinduism is a value system, but would we then also say that the kind of offshoot of that in largely westernized practices of yoga amounts to a value system? And then on what basis do we see this debate as generating its own truth claims from a value system? I mean, we could also see this as being a really good example of value pluralism actually playing out very well, which is within a value system, there is also pluralism and there is a debate going on. So what we are seeing is a debate taking place within the yoga community that has a set of beliefs and structures that come out of its value system. And this is not monolithic at all, but there's actually a debate taking place. But this literally popped up on my Twitter feed last night. And I thought this is an example that sort of problematizes and makes this challenge very real. And as I say, there are far more extreme examples we could pick, but I quite like this one. So just to finish, I wanted to think about what this would look like going further. So one thing we can obviously do is engage further with other thinkers in the value pluralist tradition, people like Gray, Hampshire, Williams. Hampshire is really interesting. I mentioned the limits on value pluralism and value systems. Hampshire actually, in the aftermath of the Second World War, was an intelligence officer, and he interviewed lots of Nazis. And this gave him a long period of time to reflect on, I mean, fundamentally, the idea of evil. Lots of his work is about the idea of evil. But it also raises the question about, again, what ideas should be and what values should be excluded from public discourse. And he spent a lot of time thinking about that. But also I think this idea about what sort of institutions actually come out of political theory. So I've offered two tests that I think come from a value pluralist perspective that we might offer, the consistency test and the coexistence test. But actually, what does this look like when you apply it to the real world? What does it look like when we apply it to things like climate change debate, COVID deniers? You know, the debate about vaccination is clearly a great example of how this might play out and be, but also be very, very challenging in practice. So I think, yeah, the idea of institutionalizing it is also very, very challenging. And I think I could probably finish with that.
Great, thanks, Nick. That was a really fascinating conversation, and the chat box is already blowing up, which is always very exciting. To start with, Riza Pasha says, there's a proverb in Turkish, the one who is bald is called hairy, and how beautifully it applies to the truth fake news conundrum, which I think is really lovely. Okay, so to start with the questions, why is there fake news? What are the reasons? Not only because of gatekeepers, some are called dog keepers, but are there also political ideological motives? I don't know if I've interpreted that question quite right, but I think, Nick, if you have any sort of other ideas around why, you know, where fake news has sort of come from, I think is being asked here.
Yeah, and I think this gets at the thing I need to think about most, because I have this very, and this is the problem I've found with sort of political theory approaches generally, is I have this very neat idea of society and how do people coexist in that society. And I think in part, so I think in part there's an answer here, which is, I think I see this idea of a sort of a liberal value pluralism, and particularly the idea of coexistence, as being to some extent a response to political polarization, political division within that society. And obviously, the reason why, and we know this from the research, but some of the reason why political and ideological motivation, why that polarization exists, is because it serves certain political and ideological projects. And so, but then on the other hand, we have an incentive for those political projects to behave in that way, because our society and its divisions is ripe for exploitation. That would be my sort of starting point with that. And then the question, I think, becomes, well, how do citizens and how do we debate with people we disagree with? And that point about the coexistence test, I think, starts to answer that question. But I think there's another issue here, which is kind of wrapped up in political and ideological motives, which is when you move beyond and I don't really touch on this in the talk, and I need to think about it more, but when you move beyond the sort of domestic setting, which is obviously, we know there's a lot of fake news in circulation because of geopolitical reasons and because of external actors. And of course, there is a sense in which I mentioned in the talk that Berlin can be understood as a cold warrior, right? It can be understood as a great defender of liberal democracies against Marxist-Leninism. And it's interesting to kind of revisit those ideas at a time when great power conflict seems to be back on the agenda. And at least one of those avenues for great power conflict is misinformation. And so I need to think a little bit more about those sorts of political and ideological motivations. But I suppose the broad umbrella point I would sort of always make about that is that sort of misinformation is effective precisely because it exploits existing divisions within a society. And if societies can construct and reconstruct their relationship with information, news and debate, then they'll be less prone to that sort of external influence.
Thanks, Nick. There are a number of questions in the chat box, and we only have a few minutes left. So I'm going to pick a question that I'm afraid is going to push you a bit into the practicalities of this. And the question says, can you say a little bit about the scope conditions for this definition? What are the preconditions that need to be met for this to apply? Party system, geography, GDP, presence of democracy, etc. And importantly, what would change in this conception of fake news if these conditions were not met? So I think just, a little bit more about sort of the practicalities of existing in a space if we agree that there are like multiple definitions of the truth and multiple ways of being. How do we actually govern that, and how do we ensure that minorities are not further victimized through the proliferation of alternative ideas about them and about the world?
So I think there's a few different questions there rolled up in that, if I've understood it correctly. I've got it in front of me because there's quite a lot in there. So I think in some ways this question is asking sort of quite a technical sort of point about, what sort of environment in terms of GDP and presence of democracy, for example, might foster this sort of model of interaction. And the honest answer is, I don't really know, beyond saying, I would imagine, I'm hesitating here because I'm wondering if it does have to be a liberal democracy necessarily. I'm sort of looking to sort of 19th century and 18th century ideas about sort of enlightened despotism, and could you imagine this sort of model functioning in that sort of society? And I suppose I had imagined it being a liberal democracy with its sort of requisite freedoms and freedom of debate. But I suppose that probably is a supposition that I could be criticised. I think you could probably imagine it functioning in other types of societies as well. And this is a really good question. I'm thinking about it as I'm trying to answer it. I suppose, though, what I would be, okay, so here's what the alternative is. And I think this is the sort of thing where it wouldn't function, which is where you have a merging of a monist definition of the truth, a singular definition of the truth, and that is combined with the power of state action. So if you think about an authoritarian society where there is a single version of the truth promulgated. Now, there is an added complication here, which again is something I need to think about, which is the role of, so I think in Berlin's world, where you think about authoritarianism or even totalitarianism and the truth, you think about the all-powerful state promulgating a single version of the truth. Now, if you look at, for example, someone like Vladimir Putin and his regime in Russia, what that in some ways trades on is extreme relativism. In other words, the truth doesn't really matter. And this has been written about, that what you kind of do is you offer so many truth claims that you undermine any belief that there can be a truth. Peter Poratzev's books on this are absolutely fantastic. But so if you like, relativism can also be linked to authoritarianism as well. So it's sort of extreme relativism can also. And Berlin writes much less about relativism than he does about monism. But arguably one of the things that's changed since he wrote is that relativism poses a very, very serious threat as well and can be linked to authoritarianism. So that's sort of a new development, if you like, that again doesn't quite fit with the theory and I think needs to be pondered some more. That was a very rambling answer to a very good question.
No, that was great. Thank you so much. We are going to have to end that part of the discussion now and make our way to the third presentation on today's panel, titled Polite Watchdog, Kompas and Watchdog Journalism in Post-Authoritarian Indonesia. So a different political context that we're going to be hearing about. And our presenter today is called Wijayanto from the Universitas and Diponegoro. I'm so sorry for butchering the pronunciation of all of that. But yeah, over to you.
Yes, it's all right. There. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Great.
we can hear you.
I will share my screen. Hopefully it works. Great. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. Good night, everyone in Asia, and maybe good morning, yeah, for those who are in Europe now. So first of all, I would like to thank Christian for organizing this and for inviting me here, and also for Thea for chairing this panel. As you read there, my name is Wijayanto. I'm from Indonesia. And I would like to present my work entitled Polite Watchdog, Kompas and Watchdog Journalism in the Post-Authoritarian Indonesia. So for those who are not familiar with Indonesia, so we are biggest democracy in Southeast Asia and throughout in the world. And we have 270 million population, making us the fourth largest country in the world. And because most of us are Muslims, so we are a Muslim democratic country, the largest in the world. So in 1998, we forego what we call as a political reform era. We ended the authoritarianism back then, and marked by the resignation of President Suharto by people power. He ruled Indonesia for 32 years, since 1967 until 1998, in authoritarian manner, banned tens of newspapers and magazines, imprisoned political journalists and political activists without any judicial process are among what he have done back then. But since 1998, the state is no longer able to ban the press because we have Press Act number 40, and no government permission is needed anymore to establish a new media. We have 100 TV stations now, more than 1,000 radio stations and printing media, which means we have much more free space for media to operate. Now, I would like to explain briefly about Kompas daily newspaper that becomes my focus. So this is the oldest newspaper in Indonesia and the largest one. It was founded in June 28, 1965. And it managed to survive in 3 different political regimes. The twilight of the authoritarian old order, 1965 to 1966. The authoritarian new order, 1967 to 1998, and the democratization era, which is now still going on. This is also the largest, the best in quality, according to some scholars at least, and I share opinion with them. Now, if we look into the normative theory of the press, some scholars have agreed that there is no free media under authoritarian regime. In an authoritarian regime, the government has absolute power and control over the press, such as ownership, control license, and the use of the mass media. Furthermore, restrictions of the press freedom in authoritarian political regimes effectively natures the media, reducing them to acting as a lapdog rather than watchdog. Now, the question then is, what has happened to the media when an authoritarian political system radically transforms into a more democratic one? Does the media automatically undergo a parallel transformation and become a watchdog of the power holders? Or does it remain as an uncritical lapdog? Before I answer the questions, I would like to clearly define what I mean by watchdog journalism. So referring to Coronel, watchdog journalism is exposure journalism. The ethical standard of the journalist or the quality of the reporting may be high or low, but what distinguishes watchdogging is the exposure of the wrongdoing in the public interest. In a normative theory of the press, it's believed that mass media should and could function as watchdog that alerts the public to misconduct of the power holders. When I look into the literatures about whether or not the media of the democratization become critical watchdog, there's a political economic factors by some scholars who argue that the media doesn't really change and doesn't really act as the critical watchdog of the power holders because of financial dependency on state advertising or personal politicians as a key of source of revenue that made the media hesitant to expose the wrongdoing of the power holders. Media ownership by conglomerates or even politicians themselves who fund or own the media also becomes another reason. In another hand, there are cultural factors. Romano, for instance, she argued that the media don't necessarily act as a critical watchdog after the political reform because of Asian values as what she called as respect for elders and leaders, concerns for upholding harmony, respect for the importance of saving face, and a preference for communicating criticism in a mild, courteous rather than brusque fashion, shape the ideas and practices of journalism in Asia, including South Asia. And in this regard, to mention some of them, this part of culture is also religion. To cite Setiono and Pintak, who quote the words of journalists, he aspired that I do not wish to be a fierce watchdog. I wish to be like the Prophet Muhammad and to spread a good agenda. Muhammad was not fierce. So in order to answer the question, I investigate the biography of the newspaper, as well as conducting an ethnographic fieldwork between August 2013 to December 2007. It was actually my PhD thesis in Leiden University. Out of the 4 years, I conducted on-site observation for 1.5 years, in-depth interview, oral history, and also content analysis of the newspaper archive. So when I learned about the biography of Kompas daily newspaper, so I found that this newspaper was born with fears since the first time it met the readers with fear and cautiousness. It cannot be separated with the context of the Cold War back then, in which in Indonesia in 1965 the Communist Party was so strong, and the underlying reason to found this newspaper is to counter the influence of Communist Party. However, unfortunately, the Communist Party was back then so strong, and they controlled the regime of license. So they had to be very cautious to make sure that they got the license to publish. And so it's also reflected in the first edition of the newspaper in 1965, 28 June, in which this paper was actually founded by two persons, Jacob Utama and PK Oyong. But the second name was not written here on the paper. Only Jacob Utama here, and there was no PK Oyong because Oyong was back then a political outcast. He found previously a media as well, but he was considered critical by the regime, so his name was blacklisted by the power holders. So as a strategy, the name of the other founder was not written in the paper. So as an attempt, when the regime changed, as an attempt to get close to avoid banning from the regime, the newspaper tried to get close with the President Suharto and become a good boy of the new order. Even the founder got award from the president, granted, reflecting how they seriously got close with the power holder. However, they still got banning. They were closed down in 1978, where after they report or they covered a news about a student protest in 1978. So the protest was demanding the president to resign from his from his office. However, the newspaper finally managed to be opened again, and this is Jacob Utama, the chief editor of the news and the founder. He said thanks to the president, and he said sorry as well. However, the president answered in rude or undefined Japanese language, never again, which brought him a trauma years after this event, this meeting. And this newspaper also has a fear or cautiousness because they are Catholic minority. So this is the words of the journalist. Never forget that Kompas is owned by the minority group, right? The bosses are Catholic, and most of them were Chinese too in the beginning. So the feeling of being inferior as minority is indeed exists. Even though we have a big building, many political elites coming to us to seek for support, our deepest feeling is fear. This fear as minority influences our every decision. And this fear is not without reason, because along Kompas history, they got attacked or protests, or their office was destroyed by the hardliners, Islamic hardliners. Every time they covered certain news about Islamic issue that is considered by some Islamic groups as inappropriate, even though you can say it's appropriate in terms of journalistic standard. And this is one of the example. So the fear of banning and the fear of as Catholic minority make them develop a certain kind of journalism called journalisme rasa. So journalisme rasa means actually journalism that based on feeling. The very notion is that they try to write in such a way not to hurt others' feeling. In the words of senior journalists, we try our best not to hurt others' feelings. That's as a Japanese culture. What's the advantage of hurting others, right? I could have written whatever I want, but will other people feel fine with that? Would they be angry or not? Would the other people feel offended? Do their hearts feel the call? So it referred to Gertz. He said that rasa has two primary meanings, feeling and meaning. Feeling refers to one of the traditional Japanese five senses: seeing, hearing, talking, smelling, and feeling. And it includes emotional feelings within the heart like sadness and happiness. As meaning, rasa is applied to the words in a letter, in poem, or even in common speech to indicate that between the lines type of in indirection and allusive suggestion that is so important in Japanese communication and social intercourse. Sorry.
I'm sorry, just a reminder, you have 2 minutes left.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Thea. So where does the Japanese value feeling come from? This comes from the founder and the chief editors of this paper, who has been there for 45 years. He is himself is a Japanese man, and he has the formula as what in conducting itself as Watchdog. He said that the classical formula of Watchdog can be delivered in black or white. The representation is to come with tolerance and self-awareness, critics with understanding, and there's a Japanese proverb quoted here, ngono yo ngono neng api ingin ibai, which means you may behave that way, but it is better this way. So in the old days, during the New Order, when they want to criticize the power holders, they write news the case of corruption in other countries. That's the strategy back then. And in the reform era, after the democratization, the strategy is they write the case of corruption. However, they wait after there is a legal case, yeah, about some corruptors or some politicians. So they make sure that it's safe. That's what they do today. And even though I argue that this is about feeling, but underlying this, the use of this style of journalism is actually to secure financial loss, to secure of suffering financially, and to avoid legal shoot by readers or by politicians and some other parties. So I think I will end here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. And we already have a question in the chat, which I think is a great question to start us off. And it says, should new democracies have their own model of media accountability / monitoring / oversight? And I wonder if maybe we could just start there, and in your experience, having done, this very in-depth ethnography of a 50-year history of a newspaper living through regime change, how do we conceptualize sort of media structures in the aftermath of a big societal and governance change? And do you have any ideas around how we should be thinking about that?
Yeah, that's thank you for the question. I think that's a very interesting question. I'm thinking about it myself. So if we refer to the journalists that I interview, or the Kompas, at least they believe that the democracy and as well as the journalism in Indonesia should be conducted in a different way from the one in the West, for instance. So the answer to your question, whether we have our own way of democracy or not, I think it depends on the conversation between journalists and also the citizen themselves, I think, because I feel that people in the ground, they're actually expecting the media to be more critical to the power holders, expecting Kompas, for instance. That's the of the public, expectation from the public, and especially nowadays, there were presentation before me, which are very interesting about the decreasing people trust to the media, and the decrease is actually surprising. And if in the case of Kompas, they don't meet the public's expectation to be more critical and to be to the power holders, perhaps they would be considered as irrelevant. This is a note for me as in my view as a researcher. But thank you again for the question.
Thanks. And I think the second question sort of builds on that, and it's from Camila, and she asks, it looks like the newspaper adapted the model of Watchdog for the local context according to the restrictions it faced. Is this similar to how Watchdog journalism works in other recent democracies like those in South America? And to what extent do you evaluate this polite watchdog, or do you think this polite watchdog approach can really hold politicians and powerful actors accountable?
Yeah, I will answer the second question first because it's easier for me. Yeah, the short answer may be no, because even though Indonesia has our own culture, and we also follow the ASEAN values as suggested by Romano. However, interestingly, we have also another flagship of journalism besides Kompas, named Tempo. Tempo was the biography of Tempo was written by Janet Steele, and Tempo is quite bold. Some of corruption cases was conducted by the court because of the exposure or the practice of investigative journalism from Tempo. Yeah. So if we talk about corruption, then perhaps Kompas don't fully function as effective tool, yeah, to hold the power holders into account. However, Kompas I think has its different function, you know, because it's polite and also, but it has also the high quality of journalism. They provide another version of journalism which is good and perhaps suitable for Indonesia. However, maybe in a different way with Tempo, the other paper. And to your questions about South America, yes, actually when I did my study 2 or 3 years ago, it's been long actually, I also read a lot the case in Latin America, and I found a similar situation actually. Yeah, but in there what I found the most was the political economic factors as the driving force of why the media don't really function as critical watchdog of the power holders despite regime change. While in the case of Kompas, the political economic factors they really play a role. However, you know, there's also cultural aspect here, cultural value that is embraced by the founder and also the chief editor for 45 years. So during that 45 years, he socialized the Japanese value, the value of rasa, of feeling in writing journalism to the publics, to the journalists, and this old culture die hard. So it's still, to some extent, it still lives until today.
Great, thank you so much. It is now 1 o'clock and time for the next panel, so we're going to leave it there. But I noticed that there are a couple more questions in the chat box, which I'm sure presenters will be happy to respond to as we move into the next panel. Thank you so much to the 3 presenters for this current panel. It's been really great to be here with you, and see you all in a few minutes as we keep going.